Okay, so today we're going to be talking about expansion of the Romans throughout Italy, and that's probably about as far as we will get in this particular lecture. What I've got here is a map of Italy, and as you can see from the title, it's how everything was organized and the groups that were found within Italy during the 400s. It's probably important to note where you find like the Latin groups, the Etruscan groups, which let me see if I can write with this. This large red area is controlled by the Etruscans. You've got the Osco-Umbrians in this gray area. And so the whole point of showing you this map is to let you see that there were actually quite a few people in Italy during the time that the Romans were starting to gain ground. And of course, you probably guessed by now, the Romans are actually going to take over all of Italy and incorporate many of these groups into its own social structure. This map is also showing you sort of the same thing, except now what it's showing you is the actual growth of the Romans. And as you can see from the header on the map, it's from about 500 to about 200, we get close to 200 BC. And so what I want you to do is to take a minute and shut off the slide and look through this, and you can see how they actually expanded. And we'll talk about some of these things in just a second. Okay, in terms of the beginning, so if you remember, we talked about the traditional date of 509 BC being the time when the Romans kicked out the kings and took over their government by having 2 consuls. Soon after this, at least according to tradition, about 500 to 499 BC, you've got Rome going to war with a group of people called the Latin League. And if you remember on that map I showed you 2 slides before, they're sort of the tannish color, the Latins. These were a group of people closely associated with each other, and they went to Rome and they ended up losing. Now the interesting thing about this is, of course, Rome gets more territory at this point. They make a treaty with the Latins called the Cassian Treaty, and it might be around 493 BC. And it's an interesting treaty in that usually when you think about warfare, you think about the victors coming in and taking over everything and kicking the people out and killing a bunch of people and then controlling the area. Rome occasionally did do that, but it was kind of rare. And this early treaty actually talks about how they incorporated the territory of the Latins into their own, which is essentially incorporating the people there. So as you can see from this slide, it was really a military agreement in that Rome would defend the Latin territory if they're attacked, and then the Latins, the Latin League, or the Latins would defend Rome if attacked. And there's more to this treaty. You've read Dionysius of Halicarnassus 6.95.2, so be sure to reread this again. This treaty is sort of a military exchange at this point. It also doesn't make the Latins Roman citizens, but as I put here on the slide, they're sort of considered to be semi-citizens. And this is one of the beauties about Roman history at this time. So I just mentioned that you don't find the Romans going in and slaughtering mass numbers of people and moving vast numbers of people out of territories and then moving in. What you see them is sort of incorporating the people who are living there with these sort of agreements really based on loyalty. Later on we'll take a look at some of these other treaties, and what they're essentially doing is owing their loyalty to the Romans, and the Romans will defend them. And what we'll also see is that the people that are owing their allegiance to Rome also have to give up men during a war. So that's part of the conditions for some of these early treaties. One thing I do want to mention is that according to a lot of archaeology and also according to some of the early Roman texts, you do find sort of a downturn in the 400s and in the early 300s. Sometimes this is called the 5th century crisis in Rome. And if you look at the archaeological record, what you see is that there are not a lot of buildings being built in the late 400s and the early 300s. So I'm talking about like 420s, 410s, 390s, 380s. That's what I mean by the early 300s. I'll talk about the sack of Gaul in just a bit, but this is in the 390s, and this probably had something to do with this downturn, or it happened right in the downturn and it made it use. And what's really interesting about this 5th century crisis is that this is not just a Roman thing. If you look through the Mediterranean, you see a lack of buildings going up throughout the Mediterranean. And the text, if you read through some of the texts of Livy and Polybius and so on, you see that there are lots of military losses, and I'll talk about the loss to the Gauls in just a second. Lots of social unrest. And in Roman history, what the social unrest is could be possibly between the patricians and the plebeians. So there might be something going on there. Now, this 5th century crisis, or what happens during the 400s, early 300s, starts to turn around in the middle of the 300s, where the economy starts to get better, they're building more buildings. But it's something to be aware of. I want to make sure that you reread Rome's Earliest Imperialism by Roland. This was a reading I had you do in week 3, and it talks about some of these issues. We know in 396, at least according to tradition, you've got the Romans starting to expand northwards into the Etruscan territories. And in particular, probably one of the more famous battles, or one of the more famous cities that were captured, is Veii, an Etruscan city. It was a very wealthy city. And by the middle of the 300s, you got the Romans sort of gobbling up these Etruscan cities. And if you remember, we talked about the Etruscans, how they were city-states. So they had their own government, their own kings, and every once in a while they would form a federation, usually in response to military issues. And that really led to their ultimate downfall, where they just could not get organized, and the Romans were just one government, not really a city-state, and by this time could control vast amounts of resources. Now, I mentioned this, so according to tradition, you've got the Gauls. If you look back a few slides and look at that map, in the far northern part of Italy, you've got a section that's controlled by these people called the Gauls. Around 390, as far as we know, these Gauls made a deep invasion into Italy and actually went into the city of Rome itself, at least according to the texts. Now, the texts make it sound like the city itself was absolutely destroyed and had to be rebuilt. Archaeology tells us something different. It doesn't really show a destruction of the city in the 390s. So whatever happened probably was pretty devastating for the people who lived in Rome, but we're pretty certain that the city was not destroyed. And what probably happened is that the Romans gave the Gauls quite a bit of money and then bought them off, and then the Gauls went home. So that's at least one of the differences between what the texts are telling us and what the archaeology is showing us. Excuse me. I had mentioned that you've got this 5th century crisis, which pushes into the 4th century. In the middle of the 300s, you get an uptick, as I put here, in building. So what we're looking at is archaeology. It looks like there's a lot of new buildings that are going up, and towards the end of this slides, I will show you just a small list of some of the things that are happening during this period. What this is really telling us is when you get more buildings being built at a certain period, you have to, the first thing you should really think of is, where's the money coming from? There's obviously money around to put into the effort of building these buildings, and we're fairly certain what's going on here is that Rome is starting to conquer a good chunk of Italy, and with that comes all the wealth of these new territories. Now, what they're doing is they're making treaties with these people, but it gives Romans access to these areas, and then people start paying taxes and so on. So you get more money, more buildings. Livy talks about one specific building that is fairly large being built around probably 380, probably starting. It wasn't really finished until after the 350s, but it was a wall around Rome. And as you can see here, I've given you some of the dimensions. It's almost 7 miles long, large blocks. These are massive blocks, and 30 feet high and 16 feet thick. This is quite a bit of human power being put into building something like this. And again, what I want you to start thinking about is, okay, there's a wall that's being built. Don't say, okay, it's just a wall. Now think about the government. What type of government do you have that can organize a group of people to build this type of wall? What kind of economy do you have? This might be telling us a little bit about social structure, like who's actually building this. And as you can see, they're taking a lot of the stone from Veii, the city that they conquered in 396. And so what it ended up doing when it was finally finished, probably in the 330s, is it encompassed about 1,000 acres. And this makes Rome one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean during this particular time period. We also see during this period of the 300s, this creation of new tribes and new colonies. And I want to make sure, I'm not going to talk about all the details here because you've read about this, especially in an article called Rome's Earliest Imperialism, and then Rome's Expansion and Roman Colonization in Italy. Some of these you read these a couple of weeks ago. And what they end up doing is talking a little bit about why new tribes are created and how they're created. And I just put here, just as a reminder, what a tribe does is it moves a whole bunch of people, or what a colony does, it moves a bunch of Romans into a new territory and then usually placed in a strategic area that Rome needs protected. So they're building a series of roads during this time, and there might be salt flats that need protected because salt is very important. So they will pop a colony in this area, which can then protect this area, and it saves the Romans from sending a large army that's maybe based in Rome to these other areas. So it really creates more manpower for the military. It creates a new economic base, and so on. And if you read through these articles, you'll see that technically this colony period started around 340, 338 BC, and really expands Roman territory during this period. Now, one of the results of this expansion is that you have all this new wealth coming in. Now, wealth really is based on agriculture during this period because they're not quite minting money. They're going to in the 300s, but not quite yet, at least being used in large amounts. And what you start to see is some failures in agriculture, meaning the weather might be bad for a couple of years, or severely cold spring, which hampers the growth or the planting of different plants. What starts to happen is that the farmers need to farm, and of course people living in the cities need to eat. So the farmers go to the wealthy people and borrow money. Now, when you borrow money, you have to pay it back, and debt, in terms of like percentage, was actually pretty high during this particular period. It was 8.5% a month, which is what the debt you would go into. So if you had like maybe say 2 years of bad weather where the farmers are continually borrowing from the patricians, those plebeian farmers owe a massive amount of money to the rich. And so what happens is you get people being sold off into slavery, and they're called a nexus, which is singular. They're temporary slaves, and they're sold off to pay the debt. And as you can see, this can start tearing apart families. Whole families can be sold into this slavery to pay back the debt. And so what you see is a series of laws being passed called the Licinian Sextinian laws, 367. And these laws are named after the consuls usually. So Licinius and so on. Some of the details of what's going on during the creation of these laws is that you've got a fairly large population living in Rome. It's guessed to be about 150,000. With the expansion into all these new colonies, what you saw, or at least it's what we can tell from the way that the laws are set up, is that the wealthy, the patricians, would rush into these areas and take huge chunks of land. And then, of course, they'd allow farmers to go on there, and this would create the whole debt cycle, especially when you've got bad crops or bad weather at a certain time. What these new laws ended up doing, they did a number of things, but one of the important things for our course is that they limited the amount of land to what one person could own. So instead of one person coming in and taking a gigantic chunk, like thousands and thousands of acres in a newly conquered land, they would limit this. They also limited excuse me, the debt that I just talked about. And what they said is that from now on, you pay back your loan, but it's principal. It's not this massive interest. And you also see when the Romans, and you've read about this in those articles, when the Romans go in and set up a new colony or set up a new tribe, a lot of the land is set aside for what they call public public use. And this could also be rented out. It was a big moneymaker for the Romans. And this was another way to sort of control the patricians going in and taking massive amounts of land. It was one way to try and reduce the debt, and they also get rid of the nexus, or the temporary slaves that could be made by Romans who couldn't pay their debt. By the time you get to the 350s, you've got the Romans taking over a significant area in central Italy. And I've given you a list of people that they are conquering: the Gauls, the Samnites, Umbrians, the Etruscans. And so by the 350s, you've got the economy starting to pick up, and it's partly as a result of taking over these new lands and all this new wealth that's coming in, all the new wealth coming in from taxes and so on. You do get, if you look at the archaeological record, you do get more buildings, and I talked about this at the very beginning, where this 5th century crisis has died down. If you look at the archaeological record, after like about 350, you get many new buildings, and these are just a few that I've listed here. You've got the Temple of Concordia being built in the Roman Forum. This is really the Temple of Peace. You've got new aqueducts, and we haven't talked about these yet. I'll have a lecture on this next, where we look at some of these aqueducts. These are very large buildings, structures that bring in water from other places. And I'll show you a map, and I'll show you how much volume of water is being brought in. You've got an area called a comitium. I haven't really talked about this, but I did mention all the citizen assemblies that get together and decide on the laws. This was enlarged during the 300s. You also see a few more things that indicate that the economy is getting better. So you start to see coinage being used during this time. They're also contacting new people, so you get maritime trade during this period. I've talked about some of the new temples excuse me, that are going up. And one thing I haven't really talked about, and we'll have a whole week of talking about this, is the increased use of slave labor. So when the Romans go into these new areas, usually what they do is they'd make one of these treaties with the people who are living there, and the Romans would protect them in exchange for men to work, to go off into war. When you have an area that's being resistant to Roman rule, the Romans would go in and kill people, enslave people, and then bring them back, sometimes into Rome, into the other territories as well. And so slaves become a major chunk of the population. In fact, in just a little bit, what's going to happen is the slave population is actually larger than the free population. And then what does all this suggest? So we talked a little bit about this before. I don't want you to think about these buildings as just being buildings. What you need to think about is, why is this happening? So I've just put a few points here. You've got increasing wealth, which is from expansion. You've got a better organized government that can organize the people to build these things. And of course, you've got all this wealth from all this expansion. We also know that there's better taxation, or a better way to collect the tax. And what the Romans end up doing, especially later on, is making tax collection sort of a private party. So what the Roman government will do is it will hire sort of a company that will collect tax for them. And the company gets to keep a little tax, and then they send the rest of the tax to the Roman government.